Hello and welcome. My name is Mark Washburn and I'm from pondalgasolutions.com. I'm one of the technical support staff over there, and I wanted to take a moment and welcome you to this webinar. If you're viewing it live, welcome. If you are viewing a recorded version, glad to have you with us, even if it's a bit later on. I think you'll still get a lot of benefit out of this information. But today we want to cover 4 powerful ways that pond aeration can improve any pond. We'll learn about some of the benefits of pond aeration, how to choose the best system for your pond, what types of pond aerators are available and how they work or where they'll work best, and so on. So there's a lot of information we're going to cover here. Just to go over quickly what we're going to talk about today. First of all, we'll cover what is pond aeration, what does it involve. We want to talk about some of the proven and powerful benefits of aerating a pond. Any size of pond can benefit greatly. We'll talk about the various forms or types of aerators and where each one is ideally suited for use. They're certainly not all the same or equal in the coverage that they can provide. We'll also talk about how to select the right system for your pond, how to keep them running well, talk a little bit about maintenance involved, and so on, and much more. So to start with, what is pond aeration? Well, pond aeration involves some type of mechanism. It's either natural or it could be mechanical, but in either case what's happening is oxygen is basically provided a way to enter into the pond water itself. In every case, oxygenation happens in an exchange that takes place at the surface of the pond. That's really the only place that air can come in from the atmosphere. And the way that this works is that any kind of agitation or a breaking of the surface tension of the pond will allow some oxygen to penetrate into the water, and then depending on what's happening within the pond itself, if there's any circulation or no circulation, the air may just stay in a very limited area or it may circulate throughout the pond. But it's through the surface itself and through the agitation of the surface in some way that makes aeration possible. Now, forms of aeration might include natural actions such as wind or waves, and this is certainly notable on the ocean or notable on very large lakes, for example. Those types of body structures use a very good form of natural aeration. They have a lot of surface area, and when the wind blows particularly and you get a lot of wave action, that is definitely aerating part of that water there. In a small pond, or in any pond, rainfall can be a factor. It certainly is aerating somewhat, and in smaller ponds, waterfalls can certainly do that. They tend to be limited in the scope of their coverage, but they certainly can have an effect, and as those water droplets come down, break the surface tension, it is definitely helping aerate and add oxygen to the pond. Mechanical aeration would include things like a fountain, both in a small pond or a large pond. It could include bubblers that sit at the surface and are not as vibrant or maybe attractive as a fountain, but they definitely will bubble the water up and move them around. There's also such things as surface agitators, which tend to provide more circulation than aeration, but they actually can be of some benefit to aeration too. And then we have subsurface aeration systems, which use a land-based pump, some airline, and then what's called a diffuser that sits at the bottom of the pond, and air is finely diffused, meaning it's released in very small bubble form, and that is released from the bottom and it travels up to the surface and provides aeration that way. Now, the key to remember with this, and it's our view that not all of these methods could be considered or should be considered equal, but they all provide some benefit and some assistance in adding air to the pond in some way. Let's talk a little bit about the true benefits of aeration, and this is really an important part of this discussion. In truth, aeration is the most influential and powerful action that can take place in a pond. Many years ago, when I first started working in the pond management industry, I had an old professional, very wise individual who said, you know, if I had one thing to do to improve a pond, I would go with aeration. I would add some form of aeration to it if I really wanted to make a difference and improve most of the ponds that we deal with. And this would include ponds that have water quality problems like algae breakouts and some unwanted growth of various kinds. It may be a very stagnant, stinky pond. It may have a lot of odors to it. You may have fish loss, and that could include fish dying off in both very hot temperatures in the summer or cold water in the winter, or ice over in the winter. And so it took a while for me personally to understand what he meant by that statement, that aeration is really the number one thing that he would look to do to improve a pond. But in the years since, we've come to learn that that is absolutely true. The key here is that any form of aeration will help to increase dissolved oxygen levels in the water. And when it comes to the overall health and well-being and balance of a pond, the key thing to remember here is that increased oxygenation helps and assists the biological processes, the natural biological processes that take place in a pond to help keep it cleaner and more balanced. This generally will involve beneficial microbes or beneficial bacteria that actually help clean up organic sediment that may have built up. It helps break down and assimilate organic matter like leaf debris and dead plant matter that may fall in there. It also will stimulate the type of bacteria that helps consume similar nutrients or lock up similar nutrients that algae may want to feed on, and thereby you can keep algae limited in its effects as well. And in a sense, these biological processes are Mother Nature's mechanism for keeping a pond clean and in good shape, in a healthy way. It helps keep odors down. All this is taking place because of good microbes, and many of these microbes are aerobic in their function, meaning they need good oxygen levels to thrive. There are anaerobic bacteria in the pond as well. Some of these are not as desirable, but by and large the ones that are doing the brunt of the cleanup and maintenance work on a pond is actually aerobic. So aeration is a prime catalyst for those to work better. Without aeration, a pond may do okay, but I would compare it, and often have compared it, to sending you to run the Boston Marathon. And just before we start off, we're going to put a plastic bag over your head and tie it at the bottom. I don't think you'll get very far if you can't get good oxygen, and you certainly will not flourish, and you may not even make it to the finish line. And the good microbes in your pond have a similar fate. If they can't have enough oxygen to thrive, they will either go dormant or they'll die off, and you won't get a good biological process in place. Also, aeration in its various forms will help increase circulation in the pond, and particularly when you have a very stagnant pond. Some ponds have incoming streams or water that may help flow through it. You may have an inflow and an outflow, which helps somewhat, but many ponds are very stagnant, and particularly down low in the pond, it just so happens that oxygen is low there, and in many cases circulation is low. And the only way that you can increase oxygen levels throughout a pond, and we'll show this later in some diagrams, is to, one, provide better aeration at the top or through bubbling at the top, and then provide circulation under the surface to help add good dissolved oxygen everywhere in the pond. Circulation will do that. Also, if you have an interest in fish, whether it's koi fish in a small pond or game fish in a larger pond, such as bass or bluegill or catfish or crappie, the fact is that these critters need good oxygen to thrive. Many people throughout the years have contacted us in a desperate state because of one of two things. Well, could be one of three things. First of all, we reach very hot summer temperatures, and this could be air temperatures in the mid to high 80s, let's say. Water temperatures generally will be above 78 degrees. But at that point, the water in the pond will not be able to hold as much dissolved oxygen. It just can't retain it as it gets hotter or warmer. And to add to this, if there is any plant growth in the pond, could be weeds, could be algae, could be duckweed, anything, and I'm speaking more on a large pond here, but it also can affect a smaller one. If you have a plant growth in there, that will affect oxygen levels in a 24-hour cycle. During the daylight, the plant is picking up photosynthesis and it will release some oxygen into the water. At nighttime, it will pull oxygen from the water and release carbon dioxide. And so basically what you've got is a situation that if you hit a very high temperature in the summer, you have some plant growth possibly. You don't need plant growth to have a problem, but it can definitely exacerbate it. And you go into the nighttime hours, you can definitely find ponds with very low oxygen levels, and when the dissolved oxygen gets so low, the fish will start to suffer. Initially it will be a stressful instance for them, but if it gets bad enough, they will start to die off through lack of oxygen. Usually larger fish will go first, and you will normally see more than just a few fish when the instance gets to be a crisis situation. At that point, it's very difficult to turn things around rapidly. But aeration is one of those things that will help protect against summer losses like this due to very high heat and low oxygen. Many people use them in the winter months in the northern climates to help restrict full ice coverage off their ponds. This last winter was a very, very hard one for many people in the upper United States. Many ponds were covered with ice for several months at a time, and come springtime, many people found that there were very large fish losses. The ice basically traps gases that can get caught up in the pond. They emanate from the bottom of the pond. Could be things like methane, among other things, that should be released. As the surface is open, those gases can come out and be released, and oxygen can come in through that opening. Aeration keeps a spot of ice open so this exchange can take place. Without it, you can run into some problems, and also oxygen depletion in the winter. So aeration is extremely useful for fish in this regard. Some people have also experienced what's called a turnover, where certain weather conditions are just right, and it usually happens in an older pond, and maybe you'll get a hard rain or a high wind, but all of a sudden the pond will literally flip over. The water from the top will want to go down, and the water from the bottom will come up, and this turnover actually creates a lot of turbulence, and it disturbs a lot of the stuff on the bottom and sometimes releases this in mass. You'll see the water get very dark or turn black all of a sudden. You may smell very bad odors, and it happens so rapidly that again, oxygen can be pulled off of the out of the water, and you'll lose a large number of fish from a turnover instance too. The other thing that I wanted to mention regarding fish before we move on is that healthy fish, very healthy fish, require good oxygen levels. They tend to be hardier, they tend to be more vibrant, they will usually eat better, and therefore if you are into the game fish, you will normally find better growth and more vitality, all of which is great for any kind of catching, releasing program, whatever. But if you want to have a good responding fish population that is enjoyable to be around or to catch, or at least to remain healthy, if you have koi fish, aeration is very beneficial for those things. Let's talk briefly about fountains. Fountains definitely add a wonderful aesthetic to any pond. As the name implies, they basically draw water up using a motor in a float device. They will pull water up into the motor and then propel it up into the air in some pattern. And as this water gets thrown up into the air and it comes back in droplets, as it breaks the surface tension of the water, it can definitely aerate the upper part of the pond. This is one thing or one reason why they tend to work well in shallower ponds. They will only affect usually the upper few feet of a pond. They work well in small ponds and in shallow, larger ponds. If you run into a pond that's much deeper than, say, 6 to 8 feet, their effects will be limited and pretty much just in the upper part of the pond. That's why we may add a fountain to a pond to provide an aesthetic improvement or something that's pleasing to look at. But if we're trying to improve the environment within the pond from top to bottom and it has some depth to it, a fountain would be a secondary consideration in putting that in. One other thing I'll note before we go on is fountains use a number of different nozzle heads or formations, and you can actually create a variety of shapes and patterns with the water going through the air. Definitely an interesting thing to add to a pond. You can hear the water hitting the surface, and that's always very nice too. I would say a couple of things in comparison to some of the other types of aeration that we'll talk about, like subsurface aeration. Fountains can be a little more problematic because they are pulling water up from the pond or from in the pond and then pulling it up and shooting it up into the air. They would tend to be more prone to clogging than some of the other things, and they also sometimes can cost more to run and operate, and so those things should be kept in mind when you're considering looking at one. Surface bubblers are another top-oriented form of aeration. As the name implies, they provide a heavy bubbling action right at the surface of the pond. They're very robust, and they work exceptionally good in shallow waters that require, I would say, heavy agitation. Maybe you have some fish in there and you really want to move the water around and you want to provide some good aeration into it. The robust agitation is very good in that setting. They are certainly more functional than they are aesthetic or pleasing to look at, but they definitely provide a valuable form of aeration in the right settings, and as I noted, they're very good for shallow ponds. I would not again consider using them actively in deeper water. I apologize for the blurry photograph here, but the circulators, as you see pictured, that black thing at the top is actually a float, and then there's a bracket that comes down, and in the simplest terms, it's a motor with a propeller on it within that cage section, and that is basically sitting under the water and helping circulate stagnant water. Most circulators, although not all, are surface based. They aren't intended to aerate as much as some of the other forms that we've talked about and will talk about, but they do help move water around. They are excellent for ice control around docks or boat ramps, things like that, and they tend to be useful for pushing oxygenated air around into backwaters. One example I would give you, if you have a large pond and you're aerating most of it, but you have a very small area maybe behind an island that's somewhere in the pond, but it's a very stagnant or shallow area behind that island where it wouldn't make sense to aerate it well, but you can put a circulator just outside of it and push some of the aerated water back in there, and it can work well in that regard too. Subsurface aerators are the type of aerators we'd like to spend a little bit more time on because they are the most impactful types of aeration that you're going to put into a pond, and the reason that they do this can be seen in the graphics to the right of this slide. On the top you'll see that a typical fountain aerator will obviously affect the upper part of that pond, but low into the pond, which is where a lot of the biological cleaning activity takes place, there is very little oxygen down there, and as a pond gets deeper and deeper and deeper, the oxygen levels tend to drop. Also, you will see temperature gradients. If you were to take a pond with no aeration and you were to slice it from top to bottom and look at it from the side, you'll see temperature gradients. In the summer, for example, the very top of that pond would be quite warm, and the deeper that you go, the cooler and cooler and cooler it gets. And one thing that's interesting is many fish have certain temperature ranges that they are comfortable in. And so you'll see fish in a bigger pond stay in one temperate zone. A lot of times they'll just stay at a particular depth of, say, 6 feet or 10 feet or whatever, wherever they're comfortable. But when you aerate from the bottom with diffused aeration, as you see in the bottom slide or picture, you'll see that it circulates and aerates the entire pond body. Those bubbles will come up rapidly from the release at the bottom. They break the surface tension of the water. They will create a light bubbling at the surface. It may not look like much at times, but it actually is doing a lot to have oxygen enter in there. And then it also creates this circular vortex that goes along that surface and then to the sides and then back down to the bottom, and it keeps turning and turning and turning as those bubbles drive upward. But you can see that it affects the entire pond from the very bottom to the very top. And when you see a pond aerated like this, the fish now have a wide temperature zone to go into. Usually they'll use much more of the pond, and for the purposes of keeping a pond in good shape, you'll notice that the air is actually being circulated down to the very bottom. That activates a lot of microbial activity down at the bottom, which helps keep muck down or helps assimilate that, and it's all a very positive thing. One interesting thing about this type of aerator compared to a fountain is that they're self-cleaning. You're driving air from that pump on the land through an airline and then out the diffuser, and usually it's made of a rubber membrane with very small pinholes in it. You're driving air out of those pinholes, and it's actually keeping it clean that way. And those pinholes also provide diffusion, these micro bubbles, which have a much more powerful effect on aeration as well as and adding oxygen to the pond as well as circulating. Here's a couple of examples of subsurface aerators. The very top one is a large pond aerator. That particular unit is using a 1/4 horsepower pump, and it probably has something like 100 feet of weighted airline, and then the diffuser, which is the white thing with the black T-looking sticks, that is actually the diffuser that sits at the bottom, and you can see the bubbles that are released out of there. This particular compressor is in a weatherproof poly cabinet. That's a see-through graphic, but normally they're not see-through, and it has a cooling fan built into the cabinet and all that. But this is basically what a typical aeration system will involve. It'll include a land-based pump, airline that runs to a single diffuser or multiple diffusers for larger settings, and a lot of times you'll see the horsepower increase in these compressors as you add diffusers to it. Normally the larger pond systems will use a rocking piston compressor or a rotary vane compressor, depending on the depth that you're dealing with. Many of them can work down to about 50 feet maximum, and there's also some shallow pond systems for larger ponds which use a linear compressor. Those actually have diaphragms inside. And then the small pond systems also use linear compressors, as you see in the lower picture. And a lot of these will need, and actually any exposed compressor, even for large ponds, if it's just a base type of system with a compressor, most of those are not weatherproof, and you will need to protect them in some way, either with a homemade cover. You can purchase cabinets for them, and the only two things to keep in mind is that you want to keep them dry. You want them out of the weather, and you also want to allow good cross ventilation for cooling. They generally will heat up as they run, and they're meant to be run continuously for their best performance. They are relatively quiet, much quieter than any kind of a shop compressor, for example, and they're designed to run pretty much 24/7 around the clock for the best results, but they do need to be protected from the elements. A lot of people have a lot of questions about selecting the right aerator for their pond, and in general they're pretty easy to size or to fit to pretty much any pond. Small ponds can be measured by gallon size. Most of these small pond aerators have a rating to them where they'll work in ponds estimated to be, let's say, around 2,000 gallons or 10,000 gallons or 12,000 gallons, whatever. They vary in what they're rated for, and if you're in the ballpark of that gallon size within a reasonable range of it. It will usually fit very well. One of the key distinctions in some of these small pond aerators is their depth capacity. You need to watch that, and I generally wouldn't push the depth too far. In other words, some of the small pond aerators have a max depth rating of about 4 feet. I wouldn't exceed that very much, because what happens is the deeper you go, you create back pressure on that compressor and on that diaphragm, and if you exceed the specifications too far, it will put a lot of strain on those diaphragms and wear them out prematurely. Most diaphragms are not covered under warranties from these manufacturers, although if something happens in the first month or so of running one of these things, these diaphragms certainly should last longer than that. Generally the warranties on them are good, however the diaphragm is a wearable part, and so they may not be covered. But you need to keep in mind that depth is one of those considerations to look at, and most small pond systems won't have a lot of airline to work with. You can't put them a long way away from the pond in order for them to remain efficient. Large ponds, when we fit those, we generally look at the surface area that we're dealing with as well as the depth, and we take those two considerations into effect. The deeper that you can get a diffuser in a large pond, the more surface area it will cover. For an example, the 1/4 horsepower system I mentioned before with a single diffuser, if you can get that diffuser down to about 12 to 15 feet in depth, it will literally affect an entire surface, or an entire acre, 1 acre of surface area, and so there's great coverage that way. Ponds larger than 2 or 3 acres, let's say, that's generally what we find, or some really oddly shaped ponds will benefit a lot from an aerial pond mapping, and we use Google Earth to do this. We take a screenshot of the pond from a satellite, and then we'll have you provide the depth, average and overall of the pond, and we will lay these out and suggest which system would work best for you, and it's very simple and easy to do. This is an example of an aerial mapping that was done. The point where all those blue lines intersect is where the pump is placed. It's probably near a power source in this example, and then the blue lines is the air line. And with this particular application, we can narrow down the airline length right down to the foot, so we know how much airline would be involved in a particular system and the setup. And then the yellow circles are actual diffusers, and they are placed strategically around the pond to provide good coverage throughout. And by this example and how close these are together, we can assume that this pond is relatively shallow. It's probably around 8 to 10 feet overall, and so that's why there's quite a few diffusers in this particular setup. If the pond were deeper, you would see them spread out more, and less would be needed to cover the same area. Let's talk a little bit about power sources for these aerators, and I'm speaking mostly of subsurface aeration again, although fountains in general, except for small ponds, fountains will need to be electrically powered. Aerators ideally should be electrically powered for the best performance in most of the cases. If we have a pond situation where there's no power right near the pond, but let's say it's 100 yards away or a couple hundred yards away, that's really not a problem, in the sense that we can run an inexpensive and lightweight burial airline that is trenched into the ground from the compressor that sits near the power source, and then connect that to weighted airline near the pond, and then that weighted airline runs to the diffusers. And I think we've run some of these systems as far as 3,000 feet successfully with no problems, and there's a number of ways that you can set this up, but just because you don't have power near the pond doesn't mean it's not possible. If you have a very remote location, windmill aerators are an option. In my mind, they're not the preferred option, because just due to their function they can be inconsistent. If you have a very hot and still day, they won't provide any aeration, but in most cases they will work even with some slight wind or breezes of a couple miles per hour, and will at least provide some benefit to a pond that otherwise may not have that opportunity. A lot of people ask about solar powered aerators, and I can tell you that right now, in terms of large pond settings, solar powered aerators are not that affordable yet. They're not cost efficient. In other words, what we've seen is if you spent $1,000 on a typical aerator package, you'd be spending about 5 times that for the solar component to try to run it 24/7. It would require the panels and the converters and a battery backup and that kind of thing to run it. What I have told people is that if someone has a knowledge of a solar arrangement, if they've worked with it before in a DIY capacity, and you can source the components yourself, you very well may be able to set something up that would run these things. We can always provide the wattage and amperage available to help you make that decision, but from a commercial perspective, in terms of packaging it with these aerators, when we've tried to source it out and have something built that would work for what we provide, it's usually been pretty expensive thus far. I don't know that it's the greatest option, but someday it may become the viable option that we hope it will, because obviously if you don't have to spend any money on electricity, if you don't have any electricity nearby, but yet you still want 24/7 operation, a solar package could provide that. Now in small ponds, there are solar fountains and solar aerators available, very small units, and they can be very useful. Again, I think powered systems are better, but at least at that level and that size of pond, you know, a small backyard pond, maybe 2,500 gallons max, a solar fountain just might help out, and they're pretty affordable. The cost to run a typical electrical aerator, and I'll use the 1/4 horsepower again, is relatively affordable. The larger compressors, the more horsepower you add, obviously the more cost will be involved, but that 1/4 horsepower system, which will in some cases be very useful up to ponds of 1 acre, can be run for less than $10 a month. Some of the shallow pond systems, which use linear compressors, they're slightly different in their design, but they can be run for under $5 a month for ponds up to, let's say, a 1/2 acre in size, and so that's relatively affordable for the coverage that they provide. Maintaining most of these aerators is pretty easy. As I mentioned before, fountains, in our experience, have tended to be a little more challenging, and it's not so much in that they're difficult to use, it's just by their very function they pull things up into them. And there are filtering screens and things that you can put on, but those sometimes should be cleaned and checked. If a pond has a lot of trouble, like with algae problems or whatever, those incoming filters and those pumps can be strained, and you can end up, we even had a case where a tadpole hatch took place and it sucked a bunch of them up into the pump and blocked it. And so you always have to be on guard to make sure that they're not getting plugged up and burning a motor out or causing problems. But normally a subsurface aerator will be pretty maintenance free. As we mentioned, they're kind of self-cleaning. The only 2 things that you really have to look at in most cases is making sure the air filters are cleaned or replaced if necessary, and then the component that helps create the air compression in a linear compressor, it would be the diaphragm. In a rocking piston compressor, it would be seal gaskets around the piston chamber. Those are wearable parts, and they really can run for several years before they may need to be replaced or updated, but what will usually occur is you'll see a drop in air output. The compressor will run, but you're just not seeing the bubbling that you did in the beginning, and that's usually indicating that there's something going on with the diaphragm wearing out, or a seal is starting to leak a little bit. And in most cases these are very easily replaced. There's kits available to update a compressor, and you can be back up and running very easily and quickly with just a few simple hand tools. It's not a complicated thing in most cases. I want to note too that for most of these compressors, and they are designed and meant to run continuously 24/7. Certainly you don't have to run them year-round, and not everybody does, but we found that the constant starting and stopping of them on a daily basis usually puts more strain on them. Particularly some of the rocking piston compressors, they tend to not do as well, or they wear out more prematurely. And I think it's because they really do heat up and get warmed up and loosened up as they run a while, and then they get very efficient. But when people try to save a little bit of money and maybe run them for a few hours a day, one, you don't really get a good quality aeration taking place on such a limited basis, and number two, it's harder on the compressor. For the best results in the pond and with the system, usually once you start it up, let's say if you run it only in the spring, summer, and fall, it's really best to let them run continuous. Now, for people that are in a more temperate climate where they don't get hard freezes in the winter, but they might have to deal with some heat in the summer, I would do just what I described. I would run them in the spring, summer, and fall to help with problems with high heat and circulation and maybe with algae issues. And then once things start to cool down in the fall, if you don't get heavy icing, you could always shut the system down if you wanted to, and there's really not as much of a demand to aerate at that point. You could aerate if you wanted to, but you wouldn't have to. We talk a lot with people every day about why, if they don't have aeration in a pond already, why aeration makes so much sense. And first and foremost, I've always realized that there is a cost to these things. But aeration systems, in whatever form you're looking at, should be looked at as an investment. They have such a powerful effect on the ponds that they're put into that there are many cases where they will lower the cost or the need for using additives. And that may include chemical or biological additives, which can certainly add up over time. Certainly if a person is using a beneficial bacteria additive in a pond and they have aeration going, they may only need to add that bacteria, a few times at best to cover an entire season of coverage. Whereas ponds that don't have good oxygenation, folks that are trying to work naturally with barley or bacteria or whatever, they tend to have to add the stuff more frequently just to get any benefit out of it, because you're going to have to compensate for that lower oxygen in the pond. And so in many cases, over the long term, aeration can more than pay for itself. And then also when you look at the protective component, if fish are important to you, they require good oxygen levels to be healthy and to grow well and to live a vibrant life. And so there's definitely an investment there, but the payoff can be great, not only in keeping a pond in better shape and better condition, and maybe spending less to do that over the years, but also keeping your fish healthy and vibrant going forward too. So it is a extremely powerful tool to add to any pond, large or small. And although I know and understand that it happens, sometimes people have to make this step after a tragedy takes place, after they've lost some important fish, or they've taken a beating because of high heat and numerous fish losses. We had one gentleman who ran a catfish, a trophy catfish fishing operation down in, I think it was the Carolinas. And a year or two ago we had a very hot summer, stifling heat, and he didn't have aeration in that pond, and he had been okay before, but he would stock this pond with very large catfish to begin with, and people would come in and pay to catch them. And we're talking 70-pound catfish maybe on average, and then they would even get bigger than that. Well, it just so happened that the weather got extremely hot for a period of time down there, and although it had never happened before, it finally hit, and he started to lose fish. The oxygen level dropped in the water, and the fish began to die. And they died, and they died. And over a period of maybe a week or two, he lost most of these fish, and they literally were taking them out by the dump truck load. And I am not exaggerating. I don't know the poundage involved, but it had to be high. They were using literally heavy loaders to pull them out of the pond and put them into a truck and take them away. And he estimated that his cost on those fish was something, initially at least, like $40,000. and he lost most of them in that time frame. Needless to say, he invested in an aerator package for his pond system, which was probably around $3,000 or $4,000, but he won't run into this type of problem again if he keeps that up and running well. And so whether it's large or small, it's a tough thing to lose fish, and aeration is definitely a tool to protect them and keep a pond in better shape too. So I hope this information is helpful. There's probably more that we could cover here, and below this video on the page that you're viewing it on, particularly in the recorded version, there will be a comment section where you can leave your questions, and we will answer those questions when we're able to. We'll try to be timely about it, but feel free to post anything there that you may be wanting to know more about. If you're interested in looking more in depth at some of these aeration systems, I can leave you with two points of contact. You can visit us directly at pondalgasolutions.com, where you'll find more information on aerators and also tools for maintaining a healthy pond in a natural fashion using beneficial bacteria and other natural tools. And then we also would like to suggest for pond aerators, fountains, circulators, visit pondaeratorsandfountains.com, and there you can get more details on the various aeration systems that are available that will work in any size of pond, large or small. So I thank you for joining me today. It's been a great pleasure to be with you, and I hope this information helps you and guides you a little bit in learning more about pond aeration and why it can be so beneficial to any pond. Hope you have a good day where you are, and we'll talk to you again real soon. Take care.